is waiting that someone in this huge company is finally clean up the mess, you know.
Absolutely. Olaf Krieger, DWTV financial correspondent, thank you so much for your time. Olaf is reporting from Frankfurt. Let's take you to Ghana, where the elections are underway as voters go to the polls. As President John Mahama is running for a second term in office against the backdrop of an economy that has slowed sharply since it took power. For years, Ghana had one of Africa's most dynamic economies, but it hit the buffers in 2014 owing to lower global prices for its gold, oil and cocoa exports and a fiscal crisis that featured a spike in the budget deficit and elevated inflation. Gamin Noyan is the senior macroeconomist at Ecobank in London. She joins us on the program. Thank you so much, Gamin, for coming on the program.
Thank you.
Now, Ghana's election is coming at a critical time in the country's history. Let's step back a little bit in time. How has the economy been in the past 4 years?
Well, we've seen the economy deteriorate sharply since 2012. It's been recording a very rapid depreciation of the currency during that time, and growth actually plummeted. Exchange reserves dropped significantly. But ever since the IMF came on board in April 2015, we've seen actually a turnaround in Ghana's economy. And that's testament to the reforms that the government has been committed, and we're seeing progress of those reforms at the moment in the economy. We've seen the reserves back up to at least 3 months of import cover. We saw the exchange rates up to like October this year. The pace of depreciation was rather slow compared to last year at this same time. Year to date, it's depreciated by about 7%. Last year was about 15%, and the year before around 32%. So that's an indication that investor appetite in Ghana's assets have improved since 4 years ago.
Now, the economy has been hit with high budget deficit and elevated inflation as a result of slow growth. What are the expectations from the citizens as they go to the polls?
Well, of course, it hasn't been easy for the typical Ghanaian person. The electricity crisis was a major issue earlier this year. We've seen some stabilization in terms of the energy crisis that has that reeled the economy for the first 6 to 9 months of this year. But we've seen some stability so far, and even though Ghana is still not out of the woods yet, I think this will continue to be factored into the minds of the locals as they go to the polls today.
I know that, like you said, the economy is not out of the woods yet, but in terms of the progress made by the government, we talked about that in reforms, and exchange rate has improved, but when we see that as a major exporter of gold, for instance, the global commodities market is still bleeding at the moment. Do you think that it can turn around, whoever wins elections will turn around this situation?
Well, I think the election will be a closely fought race. But whoever wins, I think I would expect policy continuity under the IMF program to take place. Both parties have actually openly announced their commitments in terms of continuing in engaging with the IMF. If the incumbent party wins, I'd expect continued reforms to take place. If the opposition party, the main opposition party, the NPP wins, well, I will still expect some continuity, but there might be some readjustments here and there. But in terms of the broad continuity of policy, I think we'll see Ghana's economy continue to progress over next year, and we're even expecting real GDP to come up at a stronger rate than this year, and the currency to be broadly stable, unlike in 4 years ago when we saw rapid depreciation.
Now, talking about the IMF program, the government is actually midway through the $918 million IMF program to restore economic stability. Will anything really change if the incumbent does not win the presidential election? And what kind of adjustments do you think will be made?
Well, I think the critical area is to do with the central bank financing under the current IMF program. The central bank, as the IMF is against the government going to the central bank to finance its deficits. But we saw just in Q3 this year, the government enacted into law a bill that will assure the central bank financing of around 5% of its revenue for the previous year. So that will continue to be a bone of contention between the IMF and assuming that the opposition party wins. So I think that would be the main area of concern, because if the central bank financing should be resumed, then we're likely to see high inflationary pressures in the economy, which could spiral into major imbalances for Ghana all over again.
Gamin Anoyan, Senior Macroeconomist, EcoBank London, thank you so much for your time. Now, the government of Sierra Leone's economic reform program is supported by the ECF, has achieved its key objectives despite the shocks of the Ebola epidemic and the collapse of iron ore prices and associated loss of production between 2014 and 2015. Now, this is according to the International Monetary Fund at the end of its consultation with the government of Sierra Leone. The IMF says that the West African country aims at ensuring stronger and more inclusive growth and plays a catalytic role for bilateral and multilateral assistance. Now, despite this improvement, the lender says that the government should focus on policies that anchor on economic stability through sound fiscal, monetary and debt policies while making faster progress on structural reforms. When Business Incorporated returns, we'll be taking you to Australia, where the economy slows in the last quarter. Please stay with us.